Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, even though you said everything you thought you needed to say? That tightness in your throat, like every word spoken only dragged you further from your strength. Maybe you're surrounded by people who talk over others, who mock, who dominate every room they enter, wearing arrogance like it's confidence. And maybe, deep down, you've started to believe that staying silent means you're weak, that not defending yourself is the same as surrendering, that silence equals defeat. But what if that's a lie? What if true strength was never found in your words, but in your ability to withhold them? Nietzsche, one of the most profoundly misunderstood minds in history, saw something that most people don't dare admit. That those who talk the most usually reveal the most, and those who feel the need to convince have already lost their footing. Society trains us to argue, to explain, to defend every belief as if every conversation is a war over truth. But Nietzsche offered us another path, more subtle, more dangerous, and infinitely more intelligent. He believed silence wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of power. Silence unsettles. It shakes people. It forces them to confront something they'd rather avoid. This video is for you. If you often feel invisible, talked over, invalidated. If you leave conversations wondering whether anyone truly heard what mattered. If you're tired of being the one who stays calm, the easy target, the one who holds the peace while others take advantage of your quiet. Maybe you've mistaken your silence for weakness, but today you'll see that silence can become your sharpest weapon. Because real power doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from never needing to enter one. Get ready to see silence through a new lens, not as the lack of a response, but as the ultimate response. Let's step into Nietzsche's world and learn how to master any room by saying nothing and meaning everything. Why do we feel such pressure? To jump in, to correct others, to make sure our point lands. Because we've been trained to think that truth needs defense, that if we stay quiet, we're giving the other side power, that silence equals surrender. But Nietzsche saw through that illusion. He believed that this impulse to react doesn't come from clarity, it comes from fear. The fear of appearing weak, and behind that fear sits the ego, fragile, defensive, easily provoked. It turns disagreement into threat and turns simple dialogue into combat. Nietzsche observed something sharp and unsettling. That most arguments aren't about finding truth, they're about maintaining control. People argue not because they're confident, but because their beliefs are brittle. And if those beliefs are challenged, they fear their identity won't survive the collapse. So they build verbal armor, not to grow, but to protect. And here's what that means. When you feel the urge to explain yourself, to justify your actions or opinions, you've already stepped into their trap, because needing to be understood still ties you to the need for validation. Nietzsche called this the morality of the herd, the mindset of those who live for approval, who want to be seen as kind, correct, admirable. But that craving, that need to be perceived as good, is exactly what keeps you powerless. Real strength doesn't require applause. It doesn't beg to be accepted. It holds firm, even when misunderstood, even when mocked, even when rejected. What Nietzsche offered was a shift in power, away from dominance in speech, and towards sovereignty over the self. The kind of strength that shows itself not in reaction, but in restraint. The kind that stays grounded, even when others unravel. If you want real power, you need to see this clearly. Most conversations are just performances, and the first one to play the role is already losing. Nietzsche knew the mind that reacts is already conquered, but the one that observes, the one that holds still, is the one with true control. So the question becomes, if we don't respond, how do we express strength? If words expose us, how can we make our presence felt without speaking a word? Nietzsche had an answer, and it lived in his vision of the Übermensch, a being who doesn't bend to social pressure, who doesn't seek validation from the crowd, who leads not through noise, but through mastery. In the next part, we'll uncover who this figure really is and why silence, in his hands, becomes a tool of pure dominance. Nietzsche didn't write for those who wanted comfort. He wrote for those brave enough to turn inward, to confront the darker parts of themselves and alchemize that pain into power. To him, the average person lives in chains bound by social rituals, moral expectation, and the constant craving for approval. But then there exists another kind of being, the Übermensch, not someone who reacts to the world, but someone who reshapes it in his own image. And perhaps the most powerful part? He does it in silence. The Übermensch doesn't need to win arguments. He doesn't chase emotional validation. He doesn't play cheap psychological games. He watches, he listens, he calculates. And more importantly, he knows when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Because he understands something the herd overlooks. That silence is not a void. It's a language, a force, a presence. His silence doesn't beg to be heard. It demands to be felt. It's not passive. It's charged, like thunder you can't hear, but you feel in your chest. It's power that doesn't have to announce itself. When others yell, he meets them with stillness. When they explain, he simply observes, and in doing so, he unmasks their insecurities with nothing more than his calm. His silence becomes a war, and on the other side, people panic. They guess, they project, they spiral. And in that unraveling, they expose themselves. They lose balance. But don't mistake this for inaction. This is complete command of one's own energy. This is strategic restraint. The Übermensch knows every word spoken is a move revealed. Every emotional reaction is a weakness exposed. That's why he remains quiet. Not because he lacks something to say, but because he has nothing to prove. He's already above the need to explain. His presence does all the talking, and that presence disturbs people, because it forces them inward. In a world addicted to noise, those who master silence become kings. Nietzsche saw the Übermensch as the ultimate creator of his own values, his own rules, his own reality. He depends on no one's approval. And that's why people fear him. Because nothing is more destabilizing than someone who cannot be manipulated by shame, by fear, or by the desire to belong. His silence is a shield, a fortress against the tactics of control, and when he finally chooses to speak, it's not to debate, it's to collapse an empire. But that raises a deeper question. Why does silence affect people so strongly? Why does simply refusing to react? What actually happens in someone's mind when they expect confrontation and receive nothing but quiet force? The answer lies not in philosophy, but in psychology. And that's where we're headed next. Because if you want to truly understand the power of silence, you have to see what it does to other people's minds. And I promise you, it unravels the mind in ways few are prepared for. Silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a mirror. And for many people, what it reflects back is unbearable. When you choose not to respond, you're not just withholding your voice, you're confronting them with their own. You're forcing them to hear themselves, without your reaction to distract them, without your resistance to validate them, without your presence to shield them from their own contradictions. And that shakes them, because the truth is, most people don't speak to be understood, they speak to protect themselves. They talk to avoid their own silence, to cover the distance between their words and who they really are underneath. But when you remain silent, their mask begins to slip. Psychology has proven this clearly. In moments of confrontation, silence is almost always perceived as judgment. Even if you're just listening, they feel exposed, uncomfortable, off balance. Because the moment you stop reacting, they lose their grip on the story they're trying to tell. Their brain enters survival mode. The amygdala, responsible for fear and anxiety, kicks in. Suddenly, they start projecting their own insecurities onto you. In that moment, silence becomes psychological pressure, a sharp force they can't see but can't ignore. Nietzsche understood this long before science caught up. He knew that most people are ruled by reaction. They speak without thinking. They respond to protect their image. They talk because they're terrified of being forgotten. But the higher self, the one who's mastered their inner world, doesn't rush to speak. They stay still because they know. Every word you offer is a piece of strategy revealed. Every emotional outburst is an unintentional confession, but the impact of silence runs even deeper. It dismantles manipulators, those who rely on your emotional reactions to control you, to stay in power, to keep the game going. When you offer them nothing, you shatter their rhythm. You break the pattern, and suddenly they lose themselves. They need your reaction to feel in control. Without it, they panic, they slip, they reveal the very weakness they tried so hard to hide. And yet, there's something even more profound. Silence doesn't just destabilize power games. It stirs buried wounds. It awakens old pain, feelings of rejection, fear of abandonment, memories of humiliation. Because the moment you go quiet, they realize something they can't bear. They are no longer the center. Their voice no longer commands the room. Their presence doesn't land the way it used to. And for the ego, especially the narcissistic kind, that is unbearable. So understand this. When you choose silence, you're not just protecting yourself, you're striking at the heart of illusion. That's why silence takes strength, because it's not just uncomfortable for others, it's uncomfortable for you too. It goes against everything you've been taught, everything inside you that wants to speak, explain, defend, justify. But that resistance, that's what gives silence its power, because holding still, in a world built on noise, takes discipline. Now that you've seen what silence does to others, how it shakes their confidence, reveals their masks, and collapses their control, it's time to move from understanding silence to wielding it. In the next part, you'll learn how to use silence as a conscious weapon, how to win any argument, and when you master this, no one will ever be able to control you again. There comes a point where understanding the power of silence isn't enough. It's time to stop analyzing it from a distance and start using it. Because knowledge without action is nothing but dead weight. From this moment forward, you'll learn how to convert silence from passive defense into tactical offense. No longer a shield, but a blade. Sharpened, focused, unseen until it cuts, exactly where it hurts. And it begins with a simple command, one that sounds small, but demands everything from you. Stay silent when every part of you wants to speak, when your pride begs for a response, when your ego aches to be understood, when your mind screams, "Say something." That's the poison. Every time you give in to it, you hand over control. You prove you still care what they think. You reveal you're still playing their game. But true silence begins when that need dies. When you realize you owe no explanation to anyone, that truth is still truth, even if it's never spoken. The second tool of silence is observation. While everyone else floods the air with noise, you watch, not passively, not waiting your turn, but like a strategist watches an opponent, like a hunter tracks movement in a quiet forest. You listen between the lines. You see the fear hidden behind bravado, the contradiction tucked inside certainty, the insecurity masquerading as strength. And you don't pounce, you store, you wait, because when you speak, if you choose to, it won't be to react, it will be to strike. The third weapon is time. Silence, when extended, becomes pressure. The longer they wait for your reaction, the more unstable they become. Their mind starts to unravel. They start inventing stories to fill the gap. Assumptions, fears, paranoia. They collapse into the void you've created because sometimes a quiet stare holds more power than 100 perfectly crafted sentences. And then comes the fourth weapon, unpredictability. Silence, when mastered, makes you unreadable, and people fear what they cannot read. They start to measure their words around you. They become cautious, nervous, uncertain. You flip the entire interaction. You stop being the one who reacts and become the one who shapes the rhythm. You become the center of gravity, the anchor, the presence they orbit. At that point, silence is no longer emptiness, it's command. But don't confuse this kind of silence with weakness. This isn't passivity. Nietzsche never admired those who withdrew out of fear. The silence we're talking about is not absence. It's intentional tension. It's fully alive. It's loaded with direction. You're not staying quiet because you're afraid. You're staying quiet because you're in control. You're watching, waiting for the moment when words are no longer noise, but impact. And when that moment comes, when silence has said everything it needed to, you'll speak just once. One sentence, one move. Not because it's louder, but because it's truer. But now we cross into something far more difficult. Until now, we've explored how silence can help you win. But what about when the goal isn't to win, but to survive? Because not every silence is a sign of control. Some silences are signs of submission. There are people who don't argue with you. They use you. They manipulate you. They drain you. And without realizing it, you've been giving them your power, not in a loud defeat, but in quiet surrender. You've been letting them dominate you, without ever raising their voice, without saying a single word. And this is where silence becomes dangerous, where it's no longer strength but a slow suffocation, a silent scream from someone who's lost ownership of their own life. In the next part, we'll uncover that truth. We'll expose how silence, when misunderstood, can turn from a weapon into a cage. Because while you think you're avoiding conflict, someone else might be building their entire advantage on your silence. And Nietzsche saw it coming long before we did. Is there anything more twisted than being trained to silence yourself? Not silenced by force, but by belief. By the quiet conditioning that teaches you that staying calm is maturity. That swallowing your frustration, backing down from confrontation, keeping the peace at all costs is what makes you balanced. But what if that's a lie? What if that silence, the kind you call strength, is actually submission in disguise? Nietzsche saw it for what it was, not peace, but obedience. Domesticated surrender. Have you ever noticed how some people take full advantage of your patience? Your tendency to keep the room calm, to let things slide, to avoid creating waves? They assert their opinions, claim space that isn't theirs, cross lines, and you let them. Not because you're weak, but because you've convinced yourself it's not worth the fight. That harmony matters more. That it's not a big deal. By people who have learned one thing about you, you won't push back. Nietzsche called it the morality of the enslaved. A belief system designed by the powerless to survive in a world built by the powerful. It's the morality of guilt, of self-erasure disguised as goodness. A silent rule book that teaches you to shrink, to stay agreeable, to conform, and still believe you're doing the right thing. He wrote for those ready to burn that script, to tear through the illusion and reclaim what's theirs. Because the moment you accept this form of silence, the kind that eats you from the inside, you've already given up control. You are no longer living as yourself, you're living as a reflection of what others need you to be. And that's the exact opposite of power. Because Nietzsche's idea of the will to power was never about dominance over others. It was about dominion over self. The ability to reclaim your identity, to hold your truth, without bending for applause or permission. To be silent, not out of fear, but because you owe no explanations, because your existence no longer seeks approval. The silence that comes from fear must die, and in its place, a new silence must be born, a silence that stands upright, that refuses to fold, that never apologizes for simply being. A silence that doesn't plead, but alters the room just by existing. That is the kind of silence Nietzsche admired, not retreat, but presence. The stillness of someone who has become the master of themselves. But here's the question. How do you reach that level? How do you break out of the roles others assigned you? How do you stop being the one used and become the one who commands the atmosphere without ever needing to raise your voice? How do you erase the herd morality etched inside you and emerge as a figure who radiates authority even in stillness? The answer lies where all of Nietzsche's philosophy points, the Übermensch. We've talked about him, but now it's time to go further. In the next and final chapter, you'll learn what it takes to become him. Because the world doesn't need more noise, it needs those who understand silence and use it to bend reality without sound. We've arrived at the end, but before you go, there's one truth I need you to see. True silence is full. Its presence, undeniable, unshakable. It's the moment when you stop reacting to the world and begin shaping it, not with noise, but with your very existence. Nietzsche didn't write for those who are content just to get by. He wrote for those who wanted to evolve, to tear off the masks, to live without apology, even when it hurts. The silence of the Übermensch. It isn't submission. It's the silence of someone who's already won, long before the conflict even began. It's the stillness of a mind that doesn't need to convince anyone of anything because it knows exactly who it is. And even more than that, it knows what it's worth. So now, look at your own life. Ask yourself, how many times have you stayed quiet out of fear, out of guilt, out of not wanting to offend? How many times have you let others speak over you, decide for you, bury your truth under their voice? Nietzsche would have called that a betrayal, not of others, but of yourself. Living like that is an insult to who you are. From this moment on, your silence must change its nature. It can no longer be your hiding place. It must become your declaration. An unspoken stance, a line drawn, a living, breathing affirmation of your identity, even if no one around you understands it. Because who you are doesn't need to be explained. It needs to be embodied, and that takes courage. Do you have it? Then say it, out loud, or in writing. I choose the silence that commands respect. Not for me, but for you. To plant a flag inside your own mind. To mark the beginning of something unshakable. Because yes, words carry power even when they speak on behalf of silence. And this isn't the end. The next video takes everything you've learned here and pushes it further, deeper, sharper. Watch it, not to support me, but because you are ready to go beyond the surface.